A real crisis or political theatrics? What was behind the so-called fiscal cliff standoff in Washington, D.C.? You're watching Inside Story Americas. Hello, I'm Kimberly Halkett. The fiscal cliff. It's a phrase that invokes images of an economy spiraling to the bottom. And it was that image that was supposed to force politicians here on Capitol Hill to work together to avoid the simultaneous expiration of tax cuts, as well as the implementation of deep spending cuts. But negotiations came down to the wire, with both Democrats and Republicans each blaming the other for the potential consequences of not reaching an agreement. It's just the latest in a string of standoffs here on Capitol Hill. So what does this say about the American political system and its ability to govern? Back now in our Washington studio, we are joined by Grover Norquist, president of Americans for Tax Reform. We also have Huffington Post Washington bureau chief Ryan Grim. And from New York, economist Richard Wolff. Ryan, I want to start with you. Let's talk about this in terms of the impending economic crisis that this has been portrayed as. Many have argued this was somewhat manufactured. Where do you stand on that?
Well, by definition, it was completely manufactured. You know, they sat down and behind closed doors and manufactured it, then brought it out and voted on it in broad daylight, and here we are. The extent of the economic crisis, though, remains to be seen. It would only be an economic crisis if, for the course of the entire year, none of this was undone. I've spoken to people at the IRS and looked at a bunch of the government agencies' plans, including the Pentagon. They're not planning anything right after the New Year's because they assume that Congress will get its act together at some point, whether it's mid-January or later, and undo all this. So the markets and the tax collectors and the Pentagon and the bureaucrats and everybody else that this is supposed to affect doesn't actually think it's going to affect them that much.
Grover, I mean, there's been the argument that it was Republicans who really manufactured this, going back to 2011 when there was the standoff over raising the debt ceiling.
Three pieces to the fiscal cliff. Three things change this coming week. One is the Obamacare tax increases. We don't generally talk about that, but that's $1 trillion over the next decade of higher taxes to pay for Obamacare. A bunch of that starts this week. Second, the disappearance, the lapsing of the 2001-2003 extenders, the Bush tax cuts plus. That's $5 trillion over the decade. And again, that's something that you can fix next week, next month, 2 months in. You could come back up and fix that. So it was not an emergency, but it was a reason to do something today rather than next week.
But the ordinary American very much believed that the United States was on a dangerous precipice. Its toes were hanging over. I mean,
if they believe
that,
if they believe that, the stock market would have been different. People would have been buying canned goods at the stores. That's not what's been happening. The investors have not been acting as if they expected any significant changes, and they're more mobile than other things. And then the third part is the sequestration, which is the $1.2 trillion of spending restraint, not cuts, smaller increases than Obama had planned over the next decade, half on Pentagon spending, half on domestic discretionary. That, I think, is actually a very good idea. I wish we'd go ahead and do that. I hope they still will as this moves forward. But there are three different pieces, each one set into place at a different time. They just happen to come together.
But the point is that right now the clock is still ticking. As this show will go to air, there is rumor of a deal, but there is no deal yet in place. I mean, let's talk about this, Richard. I want to bring you in. I mean, does any potential deal in all of this, does this do anything to help an economy which Americans have been led to believe is not only very fragile, but is in dire straits if some deal is not reached?
Well, let me answer your question this way. In my opinion, it's a sham. It's a political game played cynically by both sides to appeal to their bases or what they think their bases are. They could care less about what the economic effects of all of this are. It's lots of posturing. And if the American people are not much engaged with the details, then that should have shown the politicians what they ought to do. The people are right, and the politicians are again wrong. Let me explain. We have no significant difference between Republicans and Democrats on the one key dimension of all of this, which is we are about to impose austerity on the American economy. We're going to raise taxes and cut spending. That's what the Europeans did a year and a half ago. It has plunged their economy into a serious downturn, double recessions for many countries, and it has provoked the most important upsurge of social unrest and protest, not just against austerity, but against the capitalist system that is pouring these disasters on people. We are in danger as a nation of following suit. And the details between Republicans and Democrats, a little more spending here, a little less tax cut there, are details that don't change the basic picture.
Grover, has the political structure gotten us to the place that's being described here by Richard?
Well, I disagree with Richard's analysis at all levels. I think what's very interesting here is that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, which used to be regional parties, if somebody told you they were Republican, all you knew about them was that they were born north of the Mason-Dixon line, and Democrats lived in the South, and it was all driven from Civil War memories of great-grandparents as to whose party you were in. But during Reagan's lifetime, and partly because of Ronald Reagan, the two parties have moved to separate themselves out in what I consider more rational ways. The Republicans want lower taxes and less spending. Democrats want higher taxes and more spending. Size of government, power of the government, two different directions. Now, with that, there becomes a real conflict because they have a very different set of where they want to go. Now, the Republicans have actually put their plans in writing. They passed the so-called Paul Ryan budget, the plan. That's a plan out 40 years, which reforms all entitlements so that they become sustainable. It blocked grants, all the means-tested welfare programs like Clinton did.
But we did see President Obama willing to put Social Security on the table.
Yeah, well, let me just, the Republicans actually passed a budget, an entire budget, tax reform, entitlement reform, spending restraint, and they've done it twice. And they got reelected in the House with that. On the Democratic side, you see some impulses, but they haven't yet actually been able to write a budget that brings the budget and the economy into balance.
Ryan, I want to get you to jump in here. I mean, how different are the parties? Is there really that much of a difference, or is it just sort of the agendas that are different?
Right, it's not a tremendous difference. It's, Richard's point is a key one here, that Democrats maybe used to be the party that supported more spending, but President Obama has hijacked that and taken it to one of austerity. He pledged during his convention speech and throughout his campaign that he would pursue a $4 trillion grand bargain, $4 trillion deficit reduction over 10 years. He's in the process of pursuing that. Grover wouldn't like that some of that's done through tax hikes, but he's put austerity in spending on the table. There's no question about it.
Let's listen to what the president has to say, because he did. Wait a second. I want to bring in the president here. Let's get the president, because let's let him speak for himself. When President Obama spoke to the media earlier, he described the way he wanted the process to unfold. Take a listen.
I have to say that ever since I took office, throughout the campaign, and over the last couple of months, my preference would have been to solve all these problems in the context of a larger agreement, a bigger deal, a grand bargain, whatever you want to call it, that solves our deficit problems in a balanced and responsible way, that doesn't just deal with the taxes, but deals with the spending in a balanced way, so that we can put all this behind us and just focusing on growing our economy. But with this Congress, that was obviously a little too much to hope for at this time.
Richard, want to bring you in. You want to make that point. I want to get you to respond to what the president had to say there.
Well, I think it again is this theatric. Let's talk about the big spending. The big surge in spending of the last several years was agreed by Republicans and Democrats to spend a fortune of public money to bail out banks who had brought us the crisis, to bail out General Motors and other companies that had gone bankrupt through their own decision-making of their boards of directors. Now, having bailed out the people at the top, we're all supposed to worry about the deficit. And we're going to make the mass of people pay for the deficit that was created to bail out everyone but the mass of people. That ought to be on the agenda.
Are you suggesting that it's not, that this is just lip service, that there is no real intent to try and address the debt and deficit?
No, I'm saying that addressing the deficit by punishing the mass of people with social program cutbacks, with dropping the cut in the payroll tax, and all the other things that they're thinking about, this is a way of shifting the costs of an economic crisis on those least responsible for it, who have not been bailed out and should have been helped before deciding that deficit is the problem.
Grover, this is a valid criticism.
Well, first of all, I've never been arguing that the deficit is the problem. Total government spending is the problem. The deficit is the difference between how much money the government spends and how much they take.
But if they're spending on social programs, should balancing it and addressing the deficit be on the backs of middle-class and working-class Americans who are benefiting from those programs? I think that's the point that he's trying to make.
The argument that all government spending is somehow a service strikes me as nonsense. All military spending does not make us safer. Some military spending is wasted. Some makes us less safe. Some so-called domestic spending, the Davis-Bacon Act, which was put in as a racist piece of legislation to keep blacks out of work in the 1920s and 30s, building roads and so on. That law still exists, and it inflates the cost of building roads or anything the federal government builds by about 25 to 30%. That's not a service. That's a really bad piece of legislation that ought to be abolished. I mean, farm subsidies are not a service. They drive up the cost of food for poor people. The having sugar quotas on importing sugar
You're
is not a
talking about
service.
spending. Yeah, but you're talking about spending. You've just told us that taxes are a relevant part of this, too. Here's the key issue of taxation. In the 1950s and 60s, the top income tax rate for the richest Americans was 91%. Today, it's 35%. What in the world are we talking about cutting the taxes on rich people rather than discussing how we could solve the deficit by just going back to what we used to do?
Well, I mean,
why is that not part of the conversation?
Because France tried it. They fell apart.
I think the reason we're talking about it is that we don't want to talk about what we're really talking about. You know, certainly there are plenty of examples of wasteful spending and lots of spending that I would oppose, like invading Iraq or Afghanistan or something along those lines. But Grover's
or at least
been
occupying them for 10 years.
Sure, but Grover's been very clear that he opposes government spending philosophically on an ideological level. Most people, however, support government spending. So in order to create an argument against it, you have to cut taxes so you deprive the government of revenue. Then you say, oh, look, there's this gap between the spending we're doing and the revenue, so therefore we have no choice. We would love to continue these social programs. We'd love it, but we can't.
Isn't there a little bit of irony here too, as there is sort of the rumor of a possible deal, and we heard the president speaking there. You know, the two things that strike me. One is there seems to be this incredible disappointment with Congress on the part of the president, but there's also the disappointment in sort of no grand bargain, which would have resulted in cuts to social programs. So isn't it kind of ironic that by sort of yielding to some of the demands of the right, this has allowed President Obama to perhaps save face with his base?
The irony, and I'd love to hear Grover's thought on this, is that the irony is that the great savior of entitlements over the last 2 years was the Tea Party. In 2011, Obama was ready to give away the house on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, and he could not, and Boehner could not sell it to the Tea Party, and so the whole thing blew up. And now we're here getting a deal much more favorable to the president. And it might happen again.
I talked with John Kerry during these negotiations, and he wanted $1.6 trillion in higher taxes and no spending restraint, and $400 billion more in stimulus. So the willingness to do entitlements was rhetorical on Bush. How about not Clinton, Bush? How about Obama? On Obama's part, it wasn't there on the ground. The other thing is, for international viewers, they should keep in mind, Obama keeps talking about Congress as if it was one entity. There's a House and there's a Senate. The House is run by Republicans. They've actually passed a budget that goes into balance and that reforms everything that ought to be reformed. The Senate hasn't passed a budget in 3 years. The Senate is run by Democrats. The Senate is hiding, it's in a federal witness protection program, hiding their votes because they cannot get reelected if they vote the way Obama wants them to. So when you talk about Congress, those are two different things.
But one side can't do anything without the other, I think.
But it'd be nice if the Senate would pass a budget, maybe a left-wing budget that we could critique and look at, as the Republicans have passed a conservative budget.
The House passing a budget, though, is the same as the president writing a budget and sending it to Congress, because both of those parties know that neither is going to become law. It's easy for the House to say, okay, we're gonna gut entitlements, and here's our plan.
And they got reelected, having twice voted for that.
Well, that's because the districts are gerrymandered, and the only way they can lose is to the right.
I think the point that we need to looking forward is the fact that there may be some sort of 11th hour deal.
And one more point to that is that Democrats actually got more votes for the House than Republicans got. The only reason that Republicans still control the House is the way the districts are drawn.
Okay, but the bottom line still remains
will be there for 10 years.
It seems that this Congress is still going to be facing the same issues January 1 that it has been for the last 12 months. I mean, Richard, isn't that the fact that regardless of whether any deal is struck by midnight, status quo remains?
Absolutely. You know, we had 5% unemployment before this crisis hit in 2007. It went to 10% in 2009. We're now at 7.7%, which is less than halfway back. And to an economy that is not recovering, we're going to raise taxes and cut spending, which is called austerity everywhere else in the world. It is going to make life harder for the American people, and both the Republican and Democratic parties are dickering over the details and continue to show the American people that there is no political support for them.
This situation also exposes one more thing about our political situation, which is that in Congress, both parties like to say that if you cut the deficit, some type of confidence fairy will emerge, and all of a sudden we'll have growth because of that. In other words, you raise taxes, you cut spending, and we'll magically have growth. Well, later this week, we're going to do both of those things if nothing happens, and everybody's predicting doom. So it shows that they don't believe what they say.
And I want to bring President Obama in here on that, because he addressed that specifically from the White House. The U.S. President emphasized the importance of sharing the financial sacrifices equally. Let's listen to what he had to say.
If Republicans think that I will finish the job of deficit reduction through spending cuts alone, and you hear that sometimes coming from them, that sort of after today, we're just going to try to shove only spending cuts down, shove spending cuts at us that will hurt seniors or hurt students or hurt middle-class families without asking also equivalent sacrifice from millionaires or companies with a lot of lobbyists, et cetera. If they think that's going to be the formula for how we solve this thing, then they've got another thing coming. That's not how it's going to work. We've got to do this in a balanced and responsible way, and if we're going to be serious about deficit reduction and debt reduction, then it's going to have to be a matter of shared sacrifice.
The president, of course, completely misunderstands. Once we get past this fiscal cliff and we make permanent the tax cuts, now we move to the playing field of spending restraint. He just announced he doesn't want to be there. That's his life for the next 4 years. The Republicans have two major tools: don't give him a debt ceiling increase unless he cuts spending. They took $2.5 trillion out of his hide the last time we did that. That's why he's sore and unhappy. But also the continuing resolution, since the Democrats in the Senate don't pass budgets anymore.
But why is it so difficult to grapple with the concept of shared sacrifice?
But why? So here's a question.
What kind of shared sacrifice is there? I mean, what are we talking about?
I'm in favor of growth, not sacrifice.
We have had 4 million people thrown out of their homes by foreclosure. We have had somewhere between 7 and 10 million people losing their jobs. We have had countless people losing the benefits, the security of their jobs. To raise the taxes on millionaires from 35% back up to 39.5%.
Plus,
which is what Obama proposes.
Plus
That's
3.8,
not shared sacrifice.
Okay.
That's not shared sacrifice. That is the most unbalanced favoritism of corporations and the rich one could imagine.
Okay, look, that's fine rhetoric, but let's get some numbers here. Obama's not taking
No, it's the
any
numbers.
tax
It's not
rates.
the rhetoric.
Obama's not taking tax rates back to Clinton levels. He's increasing it up 3.8%. To pay for Obamacare. So these are higher rates than Clinton ever saw. Some of the rhetoric you get in the United States is we're going to Clinton rates. We're not. We should also go to Clinton spending if we're going to Clinton rates, but separate issue. Now, there are a lot of corporations that get handouts from the government, and one of the things that this administration has done is showered the green energy industry, the ethanol industry, the windmills industry, with billions of dollars of other people's money that's taken by force and given to these companies. Tens of billions of dollars have been given to General Motors. Have been given to General Motors.
It's just the environmental spending.
The government by definition does everything by force because it has a monopoly over violence. But
yes,
we also have a democracy, and people have decided that they like green energy projects because they don't want the world to be destroyed by climate change. So,
if people wanted to do
and they
that,
also
they do
want
it
much
voluntarily.
higher taxes on the rich.
They do by voting in people who pass that law.
Well, remember, the president announced we should ask people to contribute more. And I've sent a letter over to Warren Buffett suggesting that since he thinks he should pay higher taxes, I gave him, there's actually an address you can send a check into the IRS if Warren Buffett would like to do that. Instead, seeing the higher taxes come, he reorganized his investments in order to take advantage of it.
Well,
so Warren Buffett is hiding from the tax increases.
The fact that we are sort of going in circles, this is exactly what's happening on Capitol Hill, and it's now into the
We're not in circles. Well, it's not in circles.
Well, I
there are
think
two different directions.
There are two different directions. In the 11th hour, still doesn't have an agreement.
There are more than two, Grover.
I think it proves Congress has certainly proved, I think we can all agree, that by not being able to come up with an agreement by the deadline, it's proven it can't govern properly.
The House has passed a budget, and it's a budget that works. The Senate hasn't. The president's budget, which he talks about.
I think that's a partisan argument.
This is a broken record.
Of course it is. That's why you need a Republican Senate and a Republican president if you're going to fix this problem.
Oh, my goodness.
I think the bottom line
I thought the election was over.
No, actually, we have them every once in a while.
We'll get final
I know Obama thinks he made himself king, but he didn't.
Is this economy, as a result of all of this political arguing and wrangling, is it headed back into recession? Is it so fragile that it's teetering on the brink? Richard Wolff.
Well, we know what happened in England when they pursued this kind of policy. We know what happened in Greece when it pursued this kind of policy. We know what happened in Spain. I could go on. If you impose on a society in an economic crisis that has lasted 5 years a sudden increase in taxes and cutting in spending, you're going to drive the economy down. That's the last thing the American people want.
Ryan, what is the thing that American people want, in your opinion?
Well, actually, I mean, we've surveyed them. They don't like either of these plans. They don't want Social Security cut. They don't want entitlements cut. They want growth. So, like Grover said earlier, people want growth. And I wish that people would ask the question more when we talk about shared sacrifice. Well, why? The president says, we're not going to hurt widows and veterans and orphans unless the guys with the lobbyists also, take a little ding too. Well, why does that justify hurting widows, orphans, and veterans? I mean, why do we have to hurt anybody?
Amazing.
They say it's because of the deficit, but to me, that's
questions
total
that
red
all
herring.
still have to be answered. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I do appreciate all of your inputs. Thank you, gentlemen. And that is all from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Want to remind you, don't forget to follow us on Twitter as well as Facebook. That's where you can find more information about the program. We want to hear from you. Tell us what you think. Thank you for watching Inside Story Americas.